Hello. Thank you very much. Michael, thanks for giving me a chance to speak today. I'm going to forgive you for saying I had an article or a guest column in the New York Times, because I never did. And I'm not sure that, you do want to address audiences that you don't already figure you're mostly in agreement with. So there might be some virtue to appearing in the New York Times, but other than that, I'm kind of glad that I'm not associated with them. I was, I had the privilege of meeting with a smaller group of business leaders yesterday, and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to talk with you about because things changed so fast. When Michael invited me to speak here, it was so far in the past that I was wondering how to talk about how we would navigate a Kamala Harris administration. And that's thankfully not our fate. Am I speaking with a partisan crowd? I need to be careful. I'm personally overjoyed that we have an opportunity to not have to adapt to a Kamala Harris administration, because it would have been worse than the one we just got, or the one we're just finishing with. But we do have a hostile administration in Sacramento, and one of the things that I think in Kern County in particular, but elsewhere in California as well, you're going to have to navigate the tightrope between an administration in Washington that wants to do everything it can to help you be economically healthy, and an administration in Sacramento that's doing everything they possibly can to destroy your economy. I know I'm speaking a little bit in hyperbole, but I believe that sums it up fairly accurately. I was thinking about having a PowerPoint presentation as well, but I figured it would be better to just try to talk with you spontaneously to some extent. I do have some things I really want to make sure to bring up. But what I didn't want to talk about too much is the problems that we face. And if I did, if I had an inflammatory list, an accurate list, and a very incomplete list of everything that's wrong with the policies in California, particularly with energy and water, but with so many other things, it might be a more entertaining speech. Everybody would get excited and angry, and I find that when I get animated, I don't have a tremendous amount of public speaking experience, but I have enough to know that when I get riled up myself, I can feel it. I can feel it in the room, and everybody's heads go forward, everybody gets more engaged. And unfortunately, I'm going to probably bore you relative to that by talking about the solutions that I think are very practical and very feasible. And I'd like to kind of dive into them, because the other thing is I'm looking forward to some Q&A. I like being surprised by questions, and I think it's an opportunity sometimes to bring up all kinds of points that you can't possibly work into a 20-minute discussion or a speech. So I'm going to start with water. And there's four things with respect to water, four things with respect to energy that I want to talk about, because I think if you actually were able to do those four things in each of these cases, you would solve the problem. To start off with water, the State Water Resources Control Board next week, I believe it's next week, is going to rule on what they call a choice between what's called voluntary agreements, which aren't voluntary at all, and unimpaired flows. And what that choice represents is water districts in the state, hopefully, will have the opportunity to work on things that actually affect species survival, such as the habitat restoration, hatcheries, innovative hatchery techniques, doing something about introduced predators like striped bass, which are eating, that's why we have no salmon, it's because there's so many bass, and wastewater treatment. What we have in California in the Delta and in the San Francisco Bay are cities that are dumping 500,000 acre-feet a year of sewage that's treated to the point where it's not, it's not like Tijuana. It's not horrible, but it still has nitrogen, has so much nitrogen in it that it causes algae blooms, which are then attributed to climate change when it's actually because they're not treating their sewage. So when you have the voluntary agreement, you have a water district that addresses wastewater pollution, nitrogen going into the water. It does something about the predators in the rivers. Maybe creates some habitat for fingerlings so they can grow big enough to survive the trip downstream. So innovative hatchery practices, and maybe restoring some wetlands along the rivers. And it's results oriented. And what you can do if you get results is you're allowed to withdraw more water for the farms. Now the alternative, which staff at the State Water Resources Control Board overwhelmingly prefers, and let's hope that they're overruled by some of the more enlightened members of their board, is what they call unimpaired flow. And they want to require every water agency along the many tributaries of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers to leave 60% of the water in the river, no matter what, whether it's a wet year or a dry year, no matter what's actually happening in terms of species survival. So one of the things that has to happen is we need to make sure that the voluntary agreements, which by the way were just crammed down the throats of these water agencies anyway, but it's a vastly preferable choice. And if they go with unimpaired flow instead, that has to be reversed. And it's something to look at and hopefully change if it comes to that. Another thing, this is number 2 with water, is what we have with the flood nowadays is people with senior water rights upstream don't have the security if they allow people to withdraw flood water that they don't need downstream to put into recharge basins. They have the risk, until this is clearly worked out and negotiated legally, they run the risk of granting a permanent allocation to people downstream when there will be a year when they actually need all the water because it's not a wet year. So just reforming and formulating a legal framework so that there's an incentive for people downstream to invest in recharge basins is, that sounds kind of wonky, but it's fundamental. And it's an opportunity because one of the analyses I saw was that right now, on an average, because it's much more than this in wet years, but on average, in the San Joaquin Valley, there's 700,000 acre-feet of uncaptured floodwater that could be reserved. 700,000 acre-feet a year. So that's a tremendous opportunity. These things are also these are not solutions that are non-viable in today's political environment. When I talk about non-viable solutions politically in today's environment, that'll be when I'm talking about energy. But these ideas with water are things you could talk to people in Sacramento about, and if they're reasonable, they'll listen. Paleo channels. Has anybody heard of paleo channels? No hands. This San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley, the whole Central Valley used to be 400 feet lower during the Ice Age. And as the oceans rose, I'm not sure why, because there weren't any cars, but as the oceans rose over the last several millennia or eons, it rose 400 feet. The river channels were preserved, and the gravel and the rocks along the riverbeds are still there underground. And these so-called paleo channels are areas, and they exist in the Central Valley, and we're developing the technology to find them. They allow for instant, rapid recharge so that you can get the water as fast as you can divert it from the river, and you can pour it right down these things into aquifers. So that's an opportunity that would spare farmland from being gigantic recharge basins, although there are also, and I don't want to go too deep here, I'm starting to wander, but there are strata, especially on the east side of the valley, where you can get a foot a day to percolate. So you wouldn't necessarily have to reserve that much land to be able to just do it the traditional way. But if you find these paleo channels, you can just pour the water right down and you've got a recharged aquifer. And finally, with respect to water, number 4 is something called fish-friendly delta diversions. Has anybody heard of that? Yeah, I'm glad I'm talking about it then, because it's the biggest opportunity we've got. We have group in the San Joaquin Valley called the San Joaquin Valley Blueprint. They're up in Fresno County, and I recommend that your water agencies contact them. They've designed a scheme, and this is being used all over the world, and in fact they've got a somewhat smaller scale operation on the Tuolumne River right now. But what this calls for is taking a delta island, cutting a channel on the inside of the island and putting a levee parallel to the exterior levee and using that channel to line it, fill it up with rocks and gravel, put perforated pipes in there, just like gigantic French drains. And the design studies they've done so far indicate that a 200-acre site could withdraw 15,000 acre-feet of water a day. That's 1.5 million acre-feet in 100 days during a rainy, wet winter. 1.5 million acre-feet in 100 days. The estimated cost is about $2 billion. Now let's compare that to the Delta Tunnel. And I'm not here to say anything for or against the Delta Tunnel. In fact, I have to digress. When I was working on the Water Infrastructure Funding Act, which we tried to qualify for the state ballot in 2022, the Farm Bureau told me that if we included as an eligible project the Delta Tunnel, they couldn't support us. And if we did not include the Delta Tunnel as an eligible project, they couldn't support us. It's a true story. Bitterly divided, and could digress a lot about that. The farmers are not united. The water agencies are not united. If they would unite behind a common set of objectives, they could probably get it done. This, again, you compare it to the Delta Tunnel, come on, does anybody think we're going to build that for less than $30 billion? They're saying $20 to $30 billion. It'll probably take, it won't be in my lifetime. And they're anticipating 500,000 acre-feet a year from the tunnel. And you also know that as soon as the tunnel, if it ever does get built, is delivering that 500,000 acre-feet, there will be intensified litigation to stop and throttle down the existing delta pumps. What fish-friendly delta divergence does is it collects the water merely by gravity. It doesn't alter the current in the delta. It doesn't endanger fish or fish larvae. And it's a tremendous opportunity that I think really, really needs exposure and attention. I'm going to move over to energy now. I think that the only way that some of these things can happen is if the Trump administration succeeds and changes the political climate. There's absolutely nothing here, though, that's not feasible financially. It's not feasible from a technology and an engineering standpoint. We have to save the oil industry in Kern County. You can't possibly make up the economic benefit of oil and gas in Kern County with subsidies or with renewables. You just can't, even if they keep the subsidies. And they very likely will, because you've got congressmen in Louisiana and Texas who are getting most of those subsidies who aren't about to vote against them. So the people that want to keep the subsidies for hydrogen and carbon sequestration and so forth are going to include all of the Democrats and all of the Republican congressmen in Louisiana and Texas. So I wouldn't be too worried about them drying up right away. But you don't have a long-term solution there for your economy. It's not going to replace what you get out of oil and gas. And these subsidies are for things that will never exist without them. You know, California is on the bleeding edge. California is determined to be on the bleeding edge when it comes to energy technology. Elon Musk said we're 75 years away from having a full conversion to an electrified economy. And that's probably about right, especially considering that Elon Musk has no incentive to be skeptical about the future of electric vehicles. You have to change everything. And I'm sure you're well familiar with what it's going to require in terms of transmission line upgrades and of course, storage. But what kind of potential does renewables actually have in Kern County? Up in Fresno County, they want to install 200 square miles of photovoltaics. And here's a metric I won't dazzle you like Jess did, but I want to give you one engineering statistic that you really should take home with you. A square mile of photovoltaics will give you 1,000 gigawatt hours a year. Okay? And if that's the numerator, what are we, what's our denominator? California consumes 290,000 gigawatt hours a year, 290,000. So you're going to get another 200,000 gigawatt hours up in Fresno County? Okay, now you're up to 490,000 gigawatt hours. I think what I'm trying to say here is we've got the capacity to have an incredible glut of solar power. And we already do, as you saw in one of Jess's slides, during noon, during the full sun hours of the day. There is a tremendous amount of opportunity in battery technology. Stationary batteries don't have to get bounced around like they do in cars. They don't have to have a high energy density like they do in cars, and they don't have to charge in 5 minutes like we ultimately are going to have to require for cars. There's ways already, and they're emerging fast, to develop batteries that will be inexpensive and not consume valuable or scarce resources like lithium. So I think that you want to be realistic about the economic benefit of solar. You put that stuff in Kern County, most of the jobs are going to be temporary, and most of the return on investment is going to go to remote investors that come in, hedge funds that pay for all this stuff. So it's a good idea, but you can't bet the farm on it. You still need your farms. What we have to do, and hopefully again the Trump administration is going to help with this, is get rid of some of these waivers that are killing the energy industry in California, the conventional energy industry. Get rid of the waivers so that we can refine gasoline cost effectively and bring the prices down. Revise the, here's one that would make a big difference. This is actually number 3. Replace net zero with realistic carbon intensity goals. And now imagine if you did that. All of a sudden you could take all of these natural gas power plants, and Jess and I talked about this yesterday evening. Thank you for that introduction, because I was as dazzled as the rest of you trying to understand all of the expertise that you were sharing with me, Jess. But the natural gas power plants have the potential to be emitting almost a negligible amount of CO2. And if you're concerned about CO2, I'm not, but many people are, then that's a worthwhile goal. You can get to 60 from currently a really, really efficient natural gas power plant will deliver in electricity about 60% of the energy that's in the natural gas that went into it. We can get that up to 70, 75% with some of the emerging technologies. And that's the kind of thing that California should be leading the world in innovating, because that's something the rest of the world, people in the rest of the world, will actually be willing to do. And instead of letting the Russians and the Chinese invest in Indonesia or Africa or India with all of these new advanced natural gas combined cycle power plant technologies, that should be Californians that are going around the world and delivering those kinds of innovations. And if we had a realistic target, instead of net zero, having reasonable carbon intensity benchmarks, we could allow hybrids back into the mix instead of only EVs. Because as you make the transition from from internal combustion engine cars to EVs, the natural transition are the hybrids. Hybrids are the vehicles that are going to incorporate the most advanced combustion engine technologies, and there's all kinds of innovation going on with combustion engines. It's fascinating. There's also all kinds of innovations going on with batteries, with solid-state batteries that can have the durability and energy density and quick charge that you need for vehicles. So why are we forfeiting the opportunity in California to be the innovators that deliver advanced hybrids to the world market? And so if you changed the one absolute, almost, it's such a rigid absolute to say we have to get to net zero. That's terrible. What we should do is, if we're worried about CO2, then let's set realistic standards and come up with solutions that everybody in the world will be willing to emulate, because that, I thought, is what the real goal in Sacramento is. What Sacramento is doing right now is using Californians as their guinea pigs. They're using us as the laboratory to experiment. Okay, what's the economic impact of making everything so expensive so that we can fund all of these bleeding edge technologies? And that's fine, but we're not going to leapfrog our way to an all-electric economy without incredible economic hardship. So the way to do it is to gradually do it with things like advanced hybrid cars and advanced combined cycle natural gas power plants. I think that's about all I want to talk about in terms of solutions, because I think that I've given you quite enough, and we would solve everything if we would just do all of those things. So there I have all the answers. I do want to talk about allies, and then I'll be done. You can't do this yourselves. I mean, people look at the geography of the United States and they look at the geography of California and they go, we're red. Well, no, you're not. You're red geographically, but you're not red demographically. If you look at a map, and I only seen this one time, but it's a fascinating map. It's a map of the state of California where the counties are increased or shrunk based on their population. That's really interesting. And if you look at that map, of course, San Francisco is like this big, and Kern County is like that big, because Kern County is overwhelmed. In Kern County, Fresno County, San Joaquin County, they're overwhelmed demographically, population-wise. There's about 2 million people in the San Joaquin Valley. There's 40 nearly people are leaving. There's nearly 40 million people in California. And all these people on the coast are still convinced that if we don't, have EVs tomorrow, we're all going to die. I mean, I'm simplifying again, but that sort of sums it up. So we need allies. We need allies on the coast. We need people on the coast, in the millions and millions of voters on the California coast, to become allies. So who are they? Real quick. There are actually people in the social justice movement who are beginning to realize that environmentalism has harmed them more than it's helping them, and that environmentalism is out of control. And these people are very powerful politically, and they are the kind of allies that might be willing to fight hard for something like reasonable carbon intensity standards instead of net zero by 2045. For example, unions, private sector unions, the State Building and Construction Trades Union, the IBEW, the public safety unions. These guys want jobs for their members, but they also want what they say they want, which is all working families to have a chance, all households to be able to afford their bills. You can disagree on some of our policy agenda without forfeiting the right to be strongly united on things having to do with water and energy. Scientists. I can't tell you how many scientists, well, yes I can. There are so many scientists that are not, they have tenure, or they're retired, or they're in some way not at risk of cancellation or ostracization or worse, who have done very, very credible work and have concluded that yes, we do have climate change, but we don't have a climate crisis. It's not a crisis. It's something that, Elon Musk, for all his eccentricity, you have to recognize that he's a very practical-minded business industrialist, or he wouldn't have accomplished all of the things that he has. And he talks about climate change very rationally. I think I saw him say this on Joe Rogan, one of those episodes. He said, we're looking at about 2 parts per million a year. All right, so it's going to take us 100 years. We might break 500 parts per million. And that might have some effect. There might be a step change at some point if there's a big volcano erupts somewhere, but this is not something that we have to drop everything and fix today at a tremendous economic cost, and cost in human rights and property rights and everything that we cherish so much here in America. So why wouldn't it be that we're willing to amplify what some of these very credentialed scientists are saying? Who, if you listen to their presentations, and you don't ever have the opportunity to do that if you're looking at mainstream broadcast television or or newspapers or most sources online. You can't find it. You can't find it on Google. But they're out there. And if you like, we can follow up and I'll introduce you to some of their work. Scientists, unions, social justice activists, small businesses, all the small businesses. Large businesses are split because a lot of large corporations are realizing that if we accept all of these regulations, we will drive all of our emerging small competitors out of business and we'll own the market. So you have to pick and choose which large businesses are willing to fight. Reasonable environmentalists is the last on the list, and these are potential allies as well. You know, people who are realizing that floating offshore wind, for example, is a catastrophe. It's an absolute catastrophe, not just financially, but environmentally as well. I'm going to finish with this actually because I'd love to take some questions, but they're intending to put 25 gigawatts of offshore wind, floating offshore wind, off the shores of San Luis Obispo County and Humboldt County. First thing you want to know about those two counties, and I'm sure you're familiar with them geographically, is they're far removed from the high voltage backbone on the California grid, which means it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars just to install the buffering batteries and high voltage lines over rugged mountains to get all of the electricity that they're supposedly going to generate offshore into the households of Californians. These things, 25 gigawatts, first of all, that's only translates to 10 gigawatts of baseload power. California draws anywhere between 20 and 50 gigawatts at any moment. Okay, so you're not getting all of it. You're not changing the game. You're not fundamentally altering the electricity supply landscape by putting these out there. But what would it take? At 10 megawatts each, you'd need 2,500 of these floating leviathans. You would, and when I say leviathan or you know, gargantuan, I'm not exaggerating. A 10 megawatt wind turbine from the tip of the rotor to the water line is 1,000 feet. That's 3 Statues of Liberty from the water line to the tip of the torch stacked up on top of each other. It's as tall as the Eiffel Tower, 1,000 feet. They want to build 2,500 of those, and where are you going to float them from? Just imagine how they're going to industrialize the coast to do something like that. And what kind of impact would that have when it's in, you know, our continental shelf drops off right away in California. That's why they have to float. They're going to be in 4,000 feet of water. They're going to have 3 tethering cables, so that's 7,500 tethering cables, and a high voltage line that'll either be daisy chained between them, or each one of them is going to have a high voltage line underwater coming 20 miles to the coast. They want to do it 20 miles offshore. What's that going to do to the whales? What is there is so much data already on the East Coast on what's happening, not only from the noise they make, not just the noise of installing them, but the noise they make as they're turning around, what impact that has, and not only on whale populations, but all fish populations, and also the impact of the waves from the high voltage lines. So one of the things to do is stop the bad projects. You know, I talked with somewhat positive, I think, about solar. I think there's a big role for photovoltaic energy, but floating offshore wind is a catastrophe. So there are some ideas about how we can have affordable, practical water and energy. I think Kern County is in a position to do more than other counties for the simple reason it's an existential threat to you right now. Whereas in the rest of California, it's a hardship, it's a burden. But with the exception of some of the other agricultural and energy-rich counties, it's not reached crisis point yet. So you have to find allies so that you can reach out to the rest of the state and be willing to perhaps embrace some controversial thoughts like, no, we're not all about to die from a climate emergency. We do have an obligation to be prudent about how we transition and eventually replace conventional fossil fuel, but it's not a crisis. And I wish you luck with that, and the organization I'm part of wants to support you as much as we possibly can. Thank you. Questions? Got to be something. I know I didn't cover everything, so. What about you, Michael?
Is there a concern that the high power lines that are running 2,500 out into the ocean will then warm the waters up? Will it create an algae effect in that area as well?
That's a good question. I haven't heard that one before either, and they do have a temperature. You know, when you run all that current through them, probably, yeah. I mean, will it actually warm the ocean? Probably not, but there would be a local effect. There's so many things that are of concern with floating offshore wind, and I didn't talk enough about the cost. I mean, you're looking at, before overruns, you know, using marketing material from people that develop these turbines, $300 billion. $300 billion. You could retrofit every natural gas power plant in the state. You could build the Delta Tunnel. You could, $300 billion would just transform California's energy and water grid. And instead they want to burn through all that kind of money on floating offshore wind. And where's the Coastal Commission?
That'd be a good amount to spend on a desalination plant.
Well, you know, desalination's interesting because one of the reasons that desalination is so expensive is the regulatory environment that it exists in. If you were paying the prices that they're paying in Israel or Saudi Arabia or Singapore for desalination, you would find that it's not as expensive as it is here. So, you know, I'm not here to proselytize for desalination, but I don't think that it belongs out of the mix for the simple reason I'm a proponent of all of the above strategies for energy and for water. And if we have some kind of, let's say, a cyber attack that takes down the Tehachapi pumps, they would be very glad they built a couple of desalination plants down there. Yes?
Do you ever think Kern County will get their allotted water supply back from the state that they paid for?
I'm glad you asked that because I think that you should sue them. Or better yet, don't pay them and let them sue you and then defend against it. Because the contract that you're under requires you to pay whether you get 100% of your allocation or not. And all the way through the year 2000, I think there was only one really bad drought year in 20 years prior to 2000 when the farmers didn't get 100% of their allocation. And since then, the last 24 years, it's only happened 7 times. I mean, it's just changed completely. And basically, that's a bait and switch. I would recommend finding a really good law firm, getting ready, and then just don't pay them. Don't pay them. Give them they want to give you 5% of your water, pay them 5% of your contracted fees. That might do it. The other thing is the voluntary agreements versus the unimpaired flow. If we can win that battle, you're going to get more water. There was a question.
Yeah, just tag on to that. Isn't the Central Valley ag water a relatively small percent of your overall state water usage?
No. No. Agriculture uses about 30 million acre feet. Cities use about 8. What you have to remember as well, though, is the so-called environmental water, which is the water that they require to be, they divert it, they reserve it in the reservoirs, and then they release it, supposedly to save the salmon, when in dry years the salmon didn't run, and neither did the river. And that's another 30 million acre feet. Yeah, correct. What's interesting too is the farmers have used about 30 million acre feet for the last 30, 40 years, and productivity has tripled since then. So you're getting so much more out of every acre foot of water that you use. And to go on a little further there, I don't want to talk about something you're more familiar with than I am, but the flood irrigation used to recharge the aquifers. And starting in 2000, you weren't getting your full allocation. People went to drip, which has all kinds of other problems like salination because you can't flush the soil anymore. But you don't recharge the aquifers and say, okay, we're not getting our water delivery, so we're going to pump water. And now we have depleted aquifers. So it set off a chain reaction. It's possible. 12 million acre feet go through the Delta on average, even according to the Public Policy Research Institute, which they're the environmentalist good guys for the environmentalists, they acknowledge that there's 12 million acre feet a year that we don't need for the habitat on average that goes through the delta. So if we could figure out how to take the so-called big gulp, which is what the delta tunnel, again, I don't think that's a big enough gulp, but the fish-friendly delta diversions is, so if we could be more innovative on how we withdraw water from the delta, we could take a lot more out and there would not be a water shortage for farmers. You had one. Are you done? Okay, thank you.